Unlocking your potential, how to believe bigger than your fears, in the style of Elon Musk, logical, visionary, direct, pragmatic. When we talk about unlocking human potential, we're not just talking about ambition or motivation. We're talking about pushing the limits of what is physically, mentally, and even existentially possible. Most people spend their entire lives operating well below their capacity, not because they lack intelligence, not because they lack opportunity, but because they allow fear to make decisions for them. Fear is not a warning, it's a limitation protocol. It runs in the background, constantly updating you with worst-case scenarios. What if I fail? What if people laugh? What if this idea is stupid? This loop plays in the minds of billions, and it silently governs their choices. But here's something worth understanding. Progress has never come from comfort. Every leap in human achievement, from the microchip to reusable rockets, began with the exact same thing. An idea that sounded crazy and someone who was crazy enough to try it anyway. If you're going to do something extraordinary, then by definition, it cannot be ordinary. You can't expect people to get it. You can't expect the path to be smooth, and you certainly can't expect to be fearless. You just have to move despite the fear. Fear is a signal, but not a command. You have to build your belief not on emotion, but on physics. On facts. Test your limits like you would test a hypothesis. Run the experiment, gather the data, adjust, try again. If you're wrong, great, now you're less wrong. That's the entire function of iteration. The mistake most people make is waiting. Waiting to feel ready, waiting for confidence, waiting for permission. But potential doesn't unlock because you waited for the perfect moment. It unlocks because you moved anyway. You moved when it was hard. You moved when it was uncertain. You moved when nobody believed, and you moved even when you barely believed yourself. The world doesn't need more ideas that stay in notebooks. It needs execution. It needs obsession. It needs people willing to go through hell just to prove something is possible. You will not unlock your potential by staying inside the walls of what's familiar. You will unlock it by building something that doesn't yet exist, whether that's a product, a system, a solution, or a version of yourself you've never seen before. You're not going to feel ready to change the world. That's not how it works. You build readiness through pressure, through resistance, through failure, through long hours and harder decisions. Your potential is not this switch waiting to be flipped. It's more like a muscle. Force it to stretch, stress it repeatedly, and it grows. Most people build their identity around their limitations, around what they think they aren't. That's like designing a rocket by measuring its failure points instead of its thrust. It's backwards. You have to orient your thinking toward what's possible, then reverse engineer the steps. Fear shrinks when you replace emotion with engineering, when you define the risk, when you model the downside, when you make logic do what emotion can't. And if you're still scared after that, good. That means you're on the right track. If you weren't scared, it wouldn't be big enough. Start where you are, use what you have, test your assumptions, upgrade your inputs, accept the failures as part of the build, and then go again. If you make this loop your mindset, your potential becomes uncapped. Because the truth is, fear isn't your enemy. In fact, it's proof that you're getting close to something important. But belief is what gives you the energy to move forward when every part of you wants to turn back. Believe bigger than your fears, not because it's inspiring, but because it's the only way anything worth building ever gets built. Fear operates like software in the human brain, quietly running in the background, influencing our decisions, shaping our responses, and limiting our reach. It's not loud, it's not always obvious, and that makes it dangerous. Most people don't realize how many of their choices are not actually based on logic or ambition, but on subtle fear responses. Fear of rejection, fear of failure, fear of the unknown. It doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers, be careful, wait, maybe later, don't risk it. These are not instructions from a rational mind. They are automated responses from an outdated system. Fear has evolutionary roots. It was once useful. It kept us from walking into a lion's den or falling off a cliff. But in modern life, the threats we face are rarely physical. They are psychological, emotional, social. And yet, the fear response is still the same. The problem is not that fear exists. The problem is that people treat fear as a command when it's just a signal. It tells you where your limits currently are, not where they truly exist. Acting despite fear means understanding this distinction. It means acknowledging that the presence of fear is not a stop sign. It's a challenge, a data point, a test of how serious you are. When someone is afraid to speak up, afraid to start, afraid to fail, what they're really doing is assigning more power to their fear than to their vision. This is where belief becomes crucial. If fear is a limitation protocol, then belief is the override. It doesn't eliminate fear, but it deprives it of authority. Acting despite fear is how breakthroughs happen. Nobody felt fearless the first time they tried something that mattered. Nobody had absolute certainty, but the ones who broke through, the ones who changed things, were the ones who acted anyway. There's an idea in engineering that every system has a failure point. Fear is like that. It pushes until it hits resistance. If you push back harder, through action, through commitment, through iteration, fear breaks before you do. But if you let it govern your decisions, it creates a self-reinforcing loop. You avoid something because of fear, and that avoidance makes the fear grow stronger. Now the loop is closed. You never act because fear tells you not to, and because you never act, the fear remains untested, undefeated, and unchallenged. This is how people get stuck for years, even decades. Not because they don't have ideas, not because they're not capable, but because they treat fear like truth when it's just noise. Consider the cost of obeying fear. What does it take from you over time? It takes opportunity, it takes growth, it takes identity. It convinces you that the small version of you is the accurate one, when in reality it's just the most comfortable one. The greatest breakthroughs in history, in technology, in innovation, were made by people who acknowledged their fear and moved anyway. It wasn't the absence of fear that defined them. It was the refusal to let it decide. Think of flight, of space travel, of artificial intelligence. None of these were pursued because someone felt entirely fearless. They were pursued because someone believed that the risk was worth it, that the mission was larger than the discomfort. Fear always tries to shrink your goals to fit your current capacity, but your capacity isn't fixed. You grow under pressure, you learn through movement, you evolve by confronting resistance, not avoiding it. One of the most misunderstood ideas is that confidence should come before action, but confidence is the result of action. If you wait until you feel ready, you'll wait forever. Fear will always find a reason to delay. It will highlight every flaw in your plan, every uncertainty in your timeline, every weakness in your skill set. It will give you evidence that your goal is risky, unrealistic, dangerous, or even impossible. But that evidence isn't objective. It's filtered through a bias for comfort. Fear is heavily biased. It overcalculates loss and underestimates gain. It exaggerates what could go wrong and minimizes what could go right. If you take its advice, you're using flawed data to make critical decisions. Now imagine treating fear like a test variable. You recognize it, you analyze its input, you factor it into your equation, but you don't let it control the outcome. You ask, is this fear logical? Is it backed by data? Or is it emotional noise? Then you proceed with action. You design the experiment, you run the prototype, you ship the first version, you take feedback. You iterate. In doing so, you're rewriting the protocol. Every time you act despite fear, you build neural pathways that favor courage over comfort, that favor progress over paralysis, that favor long-term outcomes over short-term ease. Over time, this changes your internal architecture. You stop being someone who waits for courage to act, and you become someone who acts into courage. Fear never fully disappears, but your relationship with it transforms. You stop viewing it as something to be eliminated and start treating it as something to be leveraged. It becomes a compass, a boundary marker, a pressure gauge that tells you where the growth is. Most people try to eliminate fear before taking risks. The ones who create real change take the risk with fear sitting in the passenger seat. They don't let it drive. They don't let it choose the direction. They just let it ride along, knowing it has no real power unless they give it the keys. Acting despite fear isn't just a mindset. It's a system-level upgrade. It shifts how you approach uncertainty, how you engage with failure, and how you measure success. Success becomes less about outcome and more about input. Less about what you achieved and more about what you attempted. Because once you begin acting despite fear, you change your default mode. You stop optimizing for comfort and start optimizing for growth. And in doing so, you tap into levels of potential that comfort could never unlock. You break cycles, you rewire instincts, you discover capacities you didn't know you had, you build a future that fear would have never allowed you to see. Belief is often misunderstood as something abstract, emotional, or even spiritual. But in the context of achievement, innovation, and unlocking human potential, belief is more like a system you build and reinforce through evidence. It's not wishful thinking or blind optimism. It's a calculated structure that supports action in the face of risk. Emotions can fluctuate wildly. One moment you feel invincible, and the next completely unsure. If belief is rooted in emotion, it will collapse as soon as pressure increases. But if belief is engineered, built through repetition, trial, feedback, and adjustment, it becomes far more stable, far more effective. It becomes something you can rely on when emotion fails. To engineer belief means to treat it like a model. You build a minimum viable version, then you stress test it in the real world. You observe where it holds up and where it breaks. You don't expect perfection. You expect input. You expect to be wrong in some areas. But you use that data to refine the model. You iterate. You don't discard the entire framework every time something fails. You adjust the parts that didn't hold. Over time, the model becomes more robust. It's not theory anymore. It's tested, it's informed, it's usable. The mistake most people make is waiting for belief to feel strong before taking action. They think belief should come first, like a prerequisite. But belief is actually the output of action, not the input. If you sit around thinking, reading, planning, and waiting to believe in your ability or idea before doing anything about it, you'll always find reasons to delay. That's how fear wins. It thrives in inactivity. It multiplies in the silence between thought and action. You cannot outthink fear with more theory. You need movement. You need evidence. Belief that is built through iteration becomes self-correcting. You don't have to lie to yourself. You don't need fake confidence. You have data. You know what you're capable of because you've tested your capacity under stress. You've made mistakes, adjusted, and improved. That's not fragile belief, that's functional belief. This is the difference between people who achieve and people who stall. One group waits for confidence to take action. The other takes action and builds confidence through repeated exposure to challenge. One group overanalyzes and overprepares. The other group prototypes, deploys, and learns from impact. One is trying to eliminate uncertainty before doing anything. The other treats uncertainty as part of the process. The paradox is that when you try to feel certain before acting, you stay stuck. But when you act into uncertainty, you start to collect the very certainty you were missing. You build belief through effort, through experience, through intelligent failure. Belief becomes a system when it is no longer dependent on motivation. Most people rely on motivation to keep moving, but motivation is unreliable. It's a chemical event. It spikes and crashes. If your system of belief is only activated when you feel highly motivated, it won't last. But if your belief is rooted in process, if it's supported by structure and reinforced by results, you can keep operating even when your motivation is gone. This is how elite performers keep executing through boredom, fatigue, stress, and doubt. They've engineered belief as part of a system, not as an emotional state. To build this kind of belief, you have to stop looking for proof in the beginning. You won't have any yet. You'll have questions, resistance, and friction. That's not failure, that's the first iteration. You have to start with the assumption that your initial version will be incomplete and imperfect. Then you move, you put the version out there, you gather feedback from the environment. What worked, what didn't, where did it break? That information is fuel. You refine, you test again. You don't wait for clarity. You generate clarity through repetition. Engineered belief is also scalable. Once you've built it in one domain, fitness, business, technology, you can translate that architecture into other areas. You already know the steps. You already understand the pattern. Start small, move fast. Gather input, adapt, repeat. You don't need to be an expert in every field. You just need to understand how belief is built. Once you've proven that to yourself, you can apply that framework anywhere. This is how people make radical transitions. They don't start over from scratch every time. They transfer the process they've already validated. What makes this style of belief powerful is that it removes the need for external validation. You're not waiting for someone else to approve of your idea. You're not seeking permission to proceed. You are testing your own assumptions against reality. If the idea works, you improve it. If it fails, you learn. Either way, you gain. You are operating on a system that generates its own feedback, and that feedback is far more useful than opinions. People can doubt you. They can criticize your progress, but they cannot invalidate your data. They can't argue with tested, repeatable results. This is the level where belief becomes a competitive advantage, not because you're more talented, not because you're luckier, but because you're more resilient. Your belief doesn't collapse at the first sign of resistance. It's already been through resistance. It was built under resistance. That's what makes it reliable. You don't crumble when something fails. You already expected that. You don't panic when a plan goes wrong. You adjust the system. You iterate. When you understand this, you stop idolizing people who believed in themselves, as if that's some magical trait. It's not. It's a result of repetition, learning, and system-level reinforcement. They didn't wait for belief to appear. They built it step by step through sustained output. If something didn't work, they didn't collapse. They ran diagnostics. They fixed what was broken and tried again. Over time, their internal architecture became durable. They didn't have to feel confident to act. They acted because the system supported them. This is the foundation of long-term potential. It's not about hype or inspiration. It's not about being fearless or gifted. It's about engineering belief through deliberate action. It's about treating belief as a product you develop, not a feeling you wait for. You define what matters, you take the first step, you accept friction, and you keep moving. You don't overestimate what needs to be perfect, and you don't underestimate what consistent iteration can produce. You do the work, you build the loop, you trust the structure, belief becomes inevitable because it's been earned. Waiting for readiness is one of the most common illusions that holds people back from reaching their full capacity. The idea that there will be a perfect time, a perfect set of circumstances, a perfect mindset before taking action is appealing because it gives the illusion of control. It makes people feel safe, but it's also fundamentally false. Readiness is not a precondition for action, it is a byproduct of action. People wait to feel confident, wait to feel prepared, wait to feel validated, but those feelings rarely arrive on their own. They're not delivered through time, they're constructed through effort. Action generates clarity, movement creates feedback. Readiness is something you earn by doing, not something you inherit by waiting. The entire notion of waiting until you're ready is rooted in fear disguised as wisdom. It sounds responsible to delay, it sounds strategic, but most of the time it's just fear in disguise. Fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of imperfection. People tell themselves they're planning or preparing, but they're really stalling. They're protecting themselves from the vulnerability of being seen trying. But greatness doesn't come from avoiding exposure. It comes from being willing to look foolish, to fall short, to get back up and refine. You can't strategize fear. You have to outwork it. Those who create breakthroughs don't start because they're ready. They start because the problem is big enough, urgent enough, or meaningful enough to compel action. They move and then they figure it out. They test, they adapt, they take hits. But in that movement, they become something more than what they were. And in becoming more, they generate the readiness that so many others sit around waiting for. Waiting feels safe, but in reality, it's the riskiest strategy of all, because while you're waiting, time moves, others move, opportunities disappear, momentum fades, potential calcifies. Most people are not short on talent or ideas. They are short on execution. They spend hours consuming, planning, theorizing, but never building. They become experts in information, but novices in application. You do not build mastery through watching or reading or even thinking. You build it by putting skin in the game, by facing consequences, by learning firsthand. Delaying execution in the name of readiness is like waiting to get strong before going to the gym. It's backwards. The only way to get strong is to show up underprepared and lift anyway. The startup mind. That doesn't wait for all conditions to be perfect. It moves fast, it breaks things, it ships, then it learns. The point is to build momentum, not perfection. The goal is to learn through speed, not stagnate through polish. The ones who make progress treat the real world like a testing ground, not a final exam. They know that the faster they test, the faster they grow. And the faster they grow, the more prepared they become. Waiting slows that down, it kills speed, it traps you in overthinking. It creates friction where there should be flow. This applies to individuals just as much as to teams or companies. The internal signal that says "I'm not ready" is a default setting that needs to be reprogrammed. It is not a message from your future potential. It's a residue of your past limitations. And if you obey it, you stay locked in an outdated version of yourself. But if you override it, if you take the first step without the confidence, without the certainty, without the guarantee, then you begin a transformation. You teach your brain that you can move without a green light. You teach your nervous system that discomfort is not danger. You train your identity to include action as a default, not hesitation. Progress accelerates when your identity is based on momentum. You stop seeing yourself as someone who needs permission. You start seeing yourself as someone who moves, someone who iterates, someone who doesn't need to feel perfect in order to perform. This creates a feedback loop. Action produces learning. Learning produces growth. Growth produces capacity, and capacity reinforces belief. Now you're not just acting, you're evolving. And that evolution produces the very readiness you used to think you had to wait for. People look at those who perform at high levels and assume they must have felt ready before they started. But that's a misunderstanding of the process. They didn't feel ready. They felt uncertain, unqualified, sometimes even overwhelmed. But they moved anyway. They stepped into the gap between where they were and where they wanted to be. And by showing up in that gap consistently, they closed it. They didn't ask the world for certainty. They created their own through results. They were not fearless. They were deliberate. They chose action over anxiety. Waiting tends to be framed as strategic patience. But there's a difference between patience and paralysis. Patience is knowing the timing of a system and aligning your action with it. Paralysis is refusing to act until every variable is controlled. The truth is, most variables will never be controlled. The market will shift, the environment will change, your mood will fluctuate. If your execution is dependent on all lights turning green at once, you'll never go anywhere. You need to be willing to drive through the yellow. You need to be comfortable with partial information, with rough drafts. With beta versions, if you want to unlock your full capacity, you need to build a bias for action, not reckless, unfiltered motion, but intelligent, consistent forward movement, the kind that acknowledges uncertainty and acts anyway, the kind that doesn't wait for motivation, but instead is powered by purpose, a sense of internal necessity that overrides hesitation. That necessity can't be gifted to you. You have to build it. You have to make the mission big enough, clear enough, urgent enough to justify motion in the face of fear. When you move before you're comfortable, you gain an edge, not just over others who are still waiting, but over your previous self. You break your old patterns. You disrupt your own inertia. That disruption creates energy, and energy creates opportunities. You start to attract challenges that refine you. You start to see patterns that others miss. You become a magnet for acceleration because motion reveals what stillness hides. You see what works and what doesn't. You recalibrate. You gain insight not from guessing, but from impact. And that impact becomes your competitive advantage. Those who wait for readiness are reacting to fear. Those who act before comfort are building systems. Those systems don't guarantee success, but they do guarantee growth. They guarantee movement. They guarantee that your ideas won't die inside your head. They guarantee that something will get built, tested, broken, improved. That cycle, repeated enough times, produces outcomes that waiting never can. It builds leaders, innovators, creators, not because they were ready at the start, but because they refuse to let that stop them from starting. Potential is not an abstract concept reserved for a select few born with rare gifts or superhuman abilities. It's the capacity for improvement, innovation, leadership, and resilience that lives inside every person, waiting to be activated through execution. Imagination may light the spark, but it's execution that builds the engine. You can envision a solution, dream of a breakthrough, or imagine a future version of yourself doing extraordinary things, but unless those ideas are acted upon, tested, built, refined, and launched, they stay locked in theory. They remain hidden behind what-ifs and maybes, serving as false comfort instead of real value. Execution is the bridge between aspiration and outcome. It's what turns a possibility into something tangible, functional, measurable. Until an idea is executed, it doesn't matter how brilliant it is. The world is not lacking in vision. It's drowning in unused potential. Countless people carry bold ideas, revolutionary insights, creative solutions, and personal missions that could shift industries, solve problems, or impact lives. But ideas don't change the world. Action does. Vision without execution is like a prototype that never gets released. It might look good in theory, it might impress in conversation, but it has zero real-world utility. The reason execution unlocks potential is because it forces the idea to interact with reality, it demands friction, it invites resistance. And it's in that resistance that strength is built, that flaws are exposed, and that ideas evolve into real outcomes. Execution reveals the gap between what you think you know and what you actually understand. It humbles you. It teaches you that imagining a solution is easy, but building one is costly. Execution demands discipline. It demands time, energy, and repeated collisions with failure. That's why so few people commit to it. Because once you start executing, you lose the illusion of perfection. You can no longer hide behind the excuse of someday. You're in the arena, you're being tested, and the feedback is immediate. That's where growth happens. That's where potential expands, not in your head, but in the process of doing. People often confuse talent with output. But raw talent without execution is meaningless. You can be the smartest person in the room, the most gifted, the most creative, but if you're not putting in reps, if you're not executing consistently, then your potential remains dormant. Execution doesn't require brilliance. It requires commitment. The person who ships something imperfect every week will outperform the genius who overthinks a masterpiece that never gets finished. Velocity matters. Iteration matters. Consistency over time beats intensity in bursts. Because every round of execution adds data, every release adds insight, and every completed cycle reinforces your ability to build at scale. One of the most misunderstood aspects of potential is the belief that it needs to be discovered. But potential isn't discovered, it's revealed through work. You don't find your capacity by thinking deeply about it. You find it by doing something hard, something uncertain, something that stretches your current limits and forces you to evolve. You build your potential like you build a product. You test a version, collect feedback, identify weaknesses, and upgrade the model. That's how progress compounds. That's how ideas become systems. That's how average people produce extraordinary results. Not because they had a perfect plan, but because they had the courage to move before they were ready, and the discipline to keep going. Execution removes the gap between identity and capability. So many people hold onto outdated identities, labels formed through past failures, limiting beliefs, or early setbacks. They define themselves by who they were, not who they're becoming. But when you execute, when you consistently move forward, you begin to overwrite that identity. You stop saying, "I'm not that kind of person," and you start proving to yourself that you can adapt, that you can grow, that you can build. Execution isn't just about producing outcomes, it's about reshaping the way you view yourself. It turns dreams into data, and that data becomes confidence. Potential becomes dangerous when it's used as a substitute for results. People say, "I could do that. I was going to start. I had an idea just like that," but none of that counts. Potential doesn't pay the bills. It doesn't solve problems. It doesn't build legacy. Only action does. The most frustrating thing about wasted potential is that it's often accompanied by comfort. You convince yourself that because the potential exists, it will somehow eventually be fulfilled. But time doesn't respect potential, it only respects execution. You don't get credit for what you could have done. You get credit for what you finished, what you launched, what you refined through the fire of iteration and made real in the world. People often assume execution means perfection. That you need to have all the answers before starting, that every detail must be flawless. But perfection is a form of procrastination. It's fear dressed up as professionalism. Execution isn't about getting it right the first time. It's about getting it real the first time, shipping something small, testing a single feature, launching a rough draft. Execution is about building a system where improvement is baked into the process. You don't aim to be perfect. You aim to be better each time. That incremental progress compounds into excellence, not because you got lucky, but because you kept showing up when others stopped. Execution creates leverage. When you build something, whether it's a product, a business, a habit, or a body of work, you create assets that compound. Every piece of code, every prototype, every piece of content becomes part of your ecosystem. It adds value over time. It attracts new inputs. It generates momentum. This is something potential alone can never do. Untapped talent has no leverage. It sits still while the clock ticks, but executed ideas move. They evolve. They create openings, conversations, partnerships, progress. They become magnets for new opportunities. There's no perfect environment for execution. You will never have full clarity. You will never have complete certainty. You will always be missing some resource, some experience, some connection, but that's exactly why you execute, to learn what you don't know, to uncover the gaps, to stretch into the places where growth lives. You build the next level of your life by executing at the edge of your current ability. You move forward not because it's easy, but because there's no other way to activate what's dormant inside you. You won't find your limits by staying in the planning phase. You find them by pushing, failing, adjusting, and continuing. Execution is the great separator. It divides the ones who dream from the ones who build, the ones who talk from the ones who produce, the ones who speculate from the ones who commit. You can have brilliant ideas, endless inspiration, and a powerful vision, but if you don't put it into motion, it stays static. Untouched, untested, unavailable to the world. Potential that's never executed becomes a burden. It creates internal friction. It turns into regret, because deep down you know what you're capable of. You just haven't seen it yet. Not because it's missing, but because it hasn't been given the chance to breathe, to stretch, to live outside of your imagination through focused, repeated, intentional execution.